Hello, and welcome to How Green Is Your Deal, a podcast about Europe's path to climate neutrality. This podcast is part of GreenDeal-NET, a Jean Monnet network that brings together research and teaching on EU climate and sustainability governance. I'm your host, Jana Jöns, and I'm super excited to bring back How Green Is Your Deal. When I was moving jobs and countries, I had some time to reflect on the format and the topics of these episodes. And while I absolutely love being able to share research insight on a broad range of topics, I thought it might be nice to center them a little bit more or focus them more around the theme. So to try this out, I've decided to go for a more seasonal approach where I will publish a few episodes on a certain topic before the summer. And if this works well, I'll do another season after the fall. So in this season, we are going to dig deeper in the global dimension of EU climate policy. Like there's honestly so much going on in the world right now with the re-election of Trump, the ongoing conflicts that are reshaping global alliances, and of course the climate crisis is still intensifying as well. All of this can also have an effect on the role of the EU internationally. So to start off this season, we are going to dig deeper into what actually is happening, how it affects the EU's leadership and its climate diplomacy. I'm not going to be doing this by myself, but I am joined today by the amazing researchers and my wonderful friends, Joseph Earsom, an associate professor in environmental and climate policy at the University Catholic de Lille, and Franzisca Petri, a postdoctoral researcher at KU Leuven. Welcome. I'm so glad to have you on today. To start off with, when people talk about the EU's global leadership role and its climate policy, what do they actually mean with it?
Thanks very much, Jana. Long-time listener, first-time caller. So the EU certainly sees itself, and I think in many cases with good reason, as a leader, and I would contend that a lot of countries, particularly in the global north, would agree with that characterization. Certainly, anytime we talk about global climate governance, climate diplomacy, everyone's attention goes to the European Union's involvement in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Those annual conferences of the parties, the CUPs that we hear about every year. But what we're increasingly seeing is that climate is everywhere. So it's unsurprisingly being addressed in all these type of different global governance institutions, the G20, but also bilaterally. And that's where I'm excited to have the expertise of Franziska Petri here. But what we're seeing overall is in all these bilateral meetings, global gatherings, multilateral settings, bringing together a whole host of different types of actors, places that historically haven't dealt with climate are now seeing climate more and more on their agenda. There's more and more attention. So the challenge here that we're seeing is how can we make sure that the EU's general ambition, its general marching orders, commitment to climate, this narrative, is actually being carried out, not just in the CUPs, but when we work with partners on trade or transports, how do we make sure that the EU's positions are consistent with its overall objectives and that it's being a constructive partner?
Yeah, happy to come into that. I fully agree. And first of all, thanks for having us here. Fully agree with Joseph's assessment here. I would emphasize a bit the difficulties of leadership, because on the one hand, yes, the EU is declaring to be a leader, and as Joseph also said, it is, and there are studies that show it's seen at the UNFCCC negotiations always as one of the top ones, not necessarily the top one, but one of the ones that shapes negotiations. It's definitely big on climate finance and so on. But it's also one thing to declare that you're a leader versus actually leading. And I think in particular, when you look into the bilateral diplomacy, where then, for instance, you look at how EU delegations push climate diplomacy, you also see difficulties of where to put climate diplomacy among the many priorities that the EU has. So declarations, for sure, EU has this leadership role. But when you actually look into policy practice, into different sectors, different kinds of actors, you see there's actually different visions of what leadership would mean. In that context, I would also like to stress that also when you look within Brussels, so yes, my research has focused a lot on what is climate diplomacy across the globe and how does it link to biodiversity, to development needs, to trade needs. So there's different sectoral visions. in implementing EU diplomacy across the globe, or climate diplomacy across the globe, but also within Brussels. When you talk to people across different DGs, they're also going to emphasize different things that matter most. Or when you look at the council conclusions every year, you will see changes in emphasis across the year. So I think there is a leadership ambition. Whether the EU is effective in leading is a different question. And there's kind of different meanings to leadership and climate diplomacy within the EU.
If I could add a point
Yep. Go
to
ahead.
that, I fully agree. And I think there's always this ongoing rightful critique that the EU talks a very nice narrative, but when it comes to engaging with partners, especially those from the global south, the results can leave something to be desired. But I think what's really important to keep in mind, some of the situations in which we've seen the EU be most successful in international climate-related negotiations over the past decades, is where it's worked as a bridge builder and a convener. It's been in situations where it teams up with partners from the global south, notably small island developing states and those most vulnerable countries, these high ambition coalitions that have emerged and allowed us to overcome some of the typical gridlock we see in the global climate landscape. And we've also seen its key role as being a convener on things like the Ministerial on Climate Action, the MOCA, where it's worked with China and Canada to come together and kind of find common ground in charting a path on global climate governance issues. So I think that, to me, is one of these main issues we need to consider. Whenever we talk about the EU as a leader, to me, its power is as a bridge builder and a convener.
Thanks for that addition as well. I think those are already, well, three big interesting aspects of leadership of a global dimension that come out. Being able to kind of integrate climate in all your activities and not just focusing on these climate agreements or these climate conferences themselves. Of course, putting your words into practice, super important as well, and trying to get different visions together. But then also this role of the EU as kind of, as you said, a bridge builder and bringing people or countries together or actors together. And in that way, trying to have an impact or trying to create some momentum, some movement for change. Now, of course, we can think a little bit about as I said in the introduction, there's so much happening that also might impact how much the EU can do all these different aspects, right? Like there's shifting priorities, shifting concerns. Climate might not be on the top of its agenda. There's so much, I feel like instability is perhaps not the right word, but there's so much turbulence happening in the global world as well, with all of these conflicts popping up but ongoing. Now with Trump, there's just like this whole dimension of uncertainty that is attached to it as well. When you think about all of this stuff happening, I don't know what else to call it than stuff without getting too depressive. With everything going on, like, how do you think all of this impacts what the EU is doing, but also what it actually can do?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a lot of stuff going on, and there's a lot of noise. And I think it's really been quite challenging to see climate on the top of the agenda. If you look at war in Europe, the Russian invasion in Ukraine, Trump, obviously these days being on the top of the list. Just to share one kind of point here. When I did my PhD research on climate diplomacy of delegations, it was right after during the pandemic. And during that time, it was also very, very difficult for all attention not just to go into vaccines and everything. And still, climate diplomacy, because it links to so many topics, was able to come in. So for instance, during pandemic times, green recovery became a big narrative that then, for instance, delegations were able to push. So a lot of trouble around, a lot of noise, but there's ways, simply because the climate crisis is so urgent and relevant, to kind of link it to a constructive agenda. Well, I think just looking at now, like early 2025, there's definitely the Trump challenge. We've seen the executive order in which there is the announcement to withdraw, to also no longer financially contribute, and so on. So there is a lot of also very strong contestation of basic norms in climate governance in there. When we look at the past or the last Trump presidency, the EU was quite firm in sticking to the Paris Agreement. Trump in the beginning said things about renegotiating the Paris Agreement and so on, which did not really happen. But the the EU was really firm on just this is what we're sticking with. We believe in the Paris Agreement. They met with other actors. They kept pushing for the Paris Agreement. So I'm concerned about what this lack of ambition from the US will mean. But I don't think that the EU will stop supporting Paris. I think they'll keep on pushing for coalitions and so on. So not worried about that. But it's definitely if it's one of the major emitters who's no longer following these norms, that is definitely a problem. And then there's, of course, the Russian invasion in Ukraine, which has shifted the agenda. We also see it now. Von der Leyen just announced a massive investment program into defense spending. Yeah, if you think about where does the money go, then will it go into climate finance or will it go into defense spending? I don't think we should go into that debate because it's a very difficult question. But if you think about attention given to the topic, I think, for instance, looking at Callas's statements since the beginning of her mandate, I haven't seen as much on climate as, for instance, it was the case with Borrell. So that's one difference I would see, but I don't think that the topic is not going to keep coming up. So green diplomacy, I think, is going to keep being pushed. But I think there is a significant challenge in priorities currently simply being difficult to set.
Yes, and I think to build on that points, I certainly align myself with those very astute observations, and would definitely agree that the two main drivers, if you will, of instability and turbulence that we've seen over the past years, just looking at the news, but also digging a bit deeper in the research, is the invasion of Ukraine and Trump. And Trump, all chaos aside, I think it makes sense to look at what happened during Trump 1 for hints about how the EU will be impacted in Trump 2. And there are three main things. The first, Franzisca certainly mentioned already, with the loss of the world's second largest greenhouse gas emitter on your side, constructively engaging and pushing for progress, that certainly carries weight. That makes action in meeting these targets that we have all the more difficult. We'll also see a realignment of partnerships and alliances. For instance, during the Trump 1 years, the G20, when it came to climate, was often the G19, where everyone else would go into a different room while the US just kind of sat there. So there's going to be this need to bring people together and find these coalitions of the willing. If we look at the recent news that's come up on the security front in recent days, we may see more and more of those, or the need for that on climate, and also a further reinforcement of these non-traditional non-state-based initiatives, moving more towards wider actors, public, private, different levels of governance. And then I think finally also there's going to be a lowering of expectations. The status quo is no longer, what's acceptable is no longer increasing the ambition of your NDCs and pushing for more action. It's just staying within the Paris Agreement. So there's really this loss of this pressure that the Paris Agreement is designed around. And that could fundamentally make things difficult. But I think the one thing we're here, again, to build off of what Franzisca said, the Paris Agreement is well established. There's a lot of buy-in. But the question is about ambition, mitigation, adaptation action at a time when we don't really have time to lose, and every tenth of a degree matters.
Mm-hmm. Thanks a lot for those very interesting or insightful insights. As you said, it's not the first rodeo that we had Trump, but we've been through periods of turbulence and all of this, of course, as well, but still kind of maintain some level of ambition. Of course, what's then concerning, as you mentioned, there is only a limited amount of money, and if you invest more in security, that means maybe less for climate, and the other way around as well. So then there, as you said, shifting priorities, what are really our concerns at the moment, and how that may impact, and so forth. So thanks a lot for that. Maybe building a bit on what you just said. Of course, it is not the first time, and the EU has already shown in the past that it can then build these new alliances or make connections or try to defend the status quo, as you mentioned, instead of pushing for more. Do you feel like there's anything different about the turbulence we are in at the moment? Or do you see it more as like a continuation of trends that were there before?
Yeah, I thought a lot about this question because also in my current research, I think about, let's say, broader transformation and global governance. And I think we use this narrative like, oh, there's so much going on right now and there's a lot of noise. And for instance, I would definitely highlight the Russian invasion in Ukraine as a key change of how things work in Europe. But then I also sometimes wonder, like, okay, well, I'm doing research on these topics during the past decade. But I don't know how people, for instance, witnessed the Kyoto Protocol and the US challenge to that, right? So it's difficult, let's say, to think with a limited historical perspective. So I do think we're kind of used to turbulence in a way, and there's always this saying, right? A crisis can be a point of integration. And I think, again, even though we have turbulence, the Green Deal is going to keep going. I think von der Leyen also has continued to promote, it's called differently now, but the Green Deal is gonna stay with the climate law and so on. And what kind of makes me hopeful that we don't have to expect too much change in a way is that we also somewhat have path dependencies now, right? So we've seen challenges in the past. We've seen, for instance, the Green Deal pushing for certain priorities. So even if there's turbulences now, we can still build on what we've established in the past when maybe there was more space for climate action. So for instance, the fact that in the European External Action Service, there is a whole unit, no longer just one or two people, but a whole unit working on green transition. They're not just going to cut the staff here, even though there was talk at the very beginning that von der Leyen might cut delegation staff, but that's a different question, again, limited budget. But so we have structures in place, and that means that even though there is turbulence, we're going to keep going with these points.
Yeah, so I think, again, our answers are pretty aligned. Of course, it's very difficult to say. My own research has looked kind of more since 2015, so I don't have that long-standing perspective. But I'm always aware when teaching this topic, we see that, yeah, the US engagement, disengagement is unfortunately an established pattern. But what I think is different this time is the rest of the world remains engaged. The science is quite clear. There's a large civil society pushing behind it. So in that sense, perhaps that can be a bit of a buffer against seeing or repeating past difficulties. And I think internally from an EU perspective, of course, there's always going to be some sort of crisis, and there's always an attention focus that is going to take everyone's pressure. And we may see that with the recent pushback from the European elections and kind of this overregulation stemming from the farmers, and of course maybe this the waves of the winds of trade tensions could have an impact on the EU's capacity and willingness to push for climate ambition at the expense of competition. But I really like this point that Franzisca made about the path dependencies. There's a structure that wasn't necessarily there before if we talk about institutional memory and working strategies within the EU institutions. And also, I think there's an awareness. Some research that we have been doing is showing that the trade people, because of the political prioritization in the European Green Deal, are suddenly thinking about carbon markets. The finance people are interested. There's this, at least we see some evidence of the potential to break down silos. Now, the extent to which that will actually happen is a whole different conversation, but there's an awareness here. People see the interrelated nature of transportation policy and climate policy. So we have some more tools that we may not have necessarily had before, more of an awareness. And I think that can potentially position the EU to be in a better to weather the storm, if you will, on climates for the next couple of years.
Yeah, I think I would also fully agree with that assessment from my own research. I mean, there's also, as you mentioned now, almost 3 decades of climate policy making within the EU, but also internationally. That, of course, means a lot of investments, a lot of actions are being taken, and those are not easily just turned around or quit just because there's now one pretty bad lunatic in power. There's still like the rest of the world who might want to take action. So I think that's already quite or I guess a more hopeful message than one we hear often. So already thanks for highlighting that point as well, and that there can also be some commitment in turbulence still because of everything we have done so far. I think this translates well into my last question, which is more of a personal question that I would like to ask you as I do all my guests. Besides all of this, is there anything that still gives you hope for the future or that makes you optimistic about maybe what we can realize or what's happening? And this can really be like anything you want.
It certainly is very easy to get caught up in a doom loop and lots of doom scrolling. I'm very good at that. I was just doom scrolling this morning, as a matter of fact. But there are, I think, two things that give me hope at the end of the day. One is seeing the amazing efforts by those most vulnerable, those most confronted on a daily basis, whose existential survival is based on fighting climate change. I think in the small island developing states, young people there fighting for ambition and action. And that kind of reminds me of my own responsibility in pushing for action, the need to do more myself in pushing for action, both in my personal behaviors and other activities. And the second is young people. That might sound a bit cliche, but to see people at the high school level or bachelor's level university students, the passion which they have, even when confronted with all of this bad news, the IPCC reports, it's not so much let's give up, it's well, what are we going to do to fix this? And there's nothing more energizing to me than seeing the excitement and the ambition and the commitments of youth and young people in pushing for climate action.
Wow, that's a really strong answer. I like it in particular because my initial reaction would be, oh God, where to take hope from? Because yeah, when you read the news these days, there's a lot of bad news. And I find it difficult because when you look at empirics, such as like the climate action tracker, and you see that a lot of action of state actors is insufficient. And yeah, we go to COP30 this year, and let's see about whether ambition is going to be higher. And we saw that last year was the hottest on record, and so on. So I do think I see more challenges than, let's say, obvious solutions or sources for hope. But I was at a different multilateral negotiation last week, the biological diversity one, the CBD, and I saw positions of countries being so opposite and tensions in the room, and in the end they managed to agree on something, and there was a momentum again. So I kind of had just last week a moment where I was like, yeah, no hope, but then back to hope, kind of, because multilateralism works, and that was really, really nice to see. That despite all these disagreements and the tensions, and for instance, the small island states calling for more action because it's not enough, or all of these points, and they still kind of overcome that sometimes, and I think that's making me hopeful. And then on a personal level, I just because you always see these big actors and you see the Brussels institutions and the press releases and the big reports, the clean industrial deal and so on. But just remembering talking to so many people, and this kind of goes back to also what Joseph just said, having done many, many interviews with EU stakeholders as well as non-EU stakeholders about climate, there's so many really, really passionate people who work on this topic, including on EU climate diplomacy. They're going to make it work somehow, I hope, because I also think that a lot of these practitioners, they don't just go around and say, yes, the EU is leading on everything and so on, but they do have an understanding of that there are diverse perspectives and there is a need to, for instance, take vulnerable countries' concerns seriously and so on. So, yeah, a bit of hope based on multilateralism sometimes working out and just some really, really motivated, dedicated individuals working on this, be it youth groups, NGOs, but also EU diplomats.
All right, thanks a lot for sharing those messages of hope in these, I guess, more dark times. Something that we can all think about and keep in our hearts as well. That might stop us from doom scrolling as well, which I don't know. I feel like anytime you go on the internet right now, it is doom scrolling. By the way, maybe I should say here that we recorded this beginning of March and I'll release it end of March. So yeah, let's see.
Maybe it will be better then.
I hope it will be better then. I hope it will be better. Thanks a lot, Joseph and Franzisca. It was great to have you on.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks very much, Jana, and thanks for your excellent podcast.
That's it for this episode. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe to How Green Is Your Deal on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you are listening. If you want to stay informed on GreenDeal-NET's activities, please go to greendeal.net.eu and subscribe to the newsletter.